warm welcome to Professor Georgios Halkias, Director of the Centre of Buddhist Studies, who is joining us today with Buddhist Door Global of your research on Pyrrho of Elis and his encounters with early Buddhism.
Thank you, Rebecca, for this wonderful invitation to speak today on this topic. I have been working on the interactions between Buddhism and Hellenism for some time now. And what struck me in this research is that, of course, after Alexander the Great, there was a substantial Greek communities that were left behind in present-day Pakistan and Afghanistan. And of course, at that time, they encountered Buddhists. Basically, I was very curious. What happened after this encounter, after Alexander the Great conquered those areas and left substantial settlements of Greeks behind him? And that's in present-day Pakistan and Afghanistan. And then my question was, what happened when those two civilizational traditions, this very civilization, again, these great civilizations met one another, Hellenism and Buddhism? What was the outcome? Was there some sort of influence? And as I started investigating this topic, I found a character called Pyrrho of Elis, as you mentioned, who was born in the Peloponnese in the southern Greece. And he was one that joined Alexander the Great in his think tank. Because, a lot of people think Alexander traveled with his military. Yes, that was part, but he also had his own think tank. And in that think tank, he had philosophers, historians, geographers, artists, name it. So they were kind of his civilizational, cultural entourage that accompanied him and advised him on significant matters. So among those people, Pyrrho was one of them. And he spent 2 years in Bactria and 3 years in Gandhara in present-day Pakistan, which was a sufficient time to interact with local religious traditions, Indian traditions that were in existence at the time. Now, this is where I'm a bit controversial perhaps from other scholars, in that I think, and I believe, and I think I have enough evidence, which we won't have time to explore, but I did discuss this in my articles, is that Pyrrho met also some Buddhist ascetics at the time, which were not yet formed into the Buddhist Sangha as we know it. It was early Buddhist traditions. And I think he interacted and got really influenced from them. And he brought whatever he learned from those masters back to Greece, where we have actually the first attested form of Buddhism in the West. And this is what I presented at Renda. And it was well received. And it's not the only place. I have actually given this talk in several places. And I have received, not always positive feedback. There's some people who are skeptical, and I understand that. The evidence is not conclusive, but it's enough to actually make us wonder, maybe this interaction between Greeks and Buddhists led to something beautiful that we know as Mahayana Buddhism. Or at least it was one force that influenced its development.
Georgios, is Pyrrho connected with Aristotle, who is the famous teacher of Alexander the Great?
Not directly. The question is a good question. You're asking whether they knew each other, since they were probably lived at the same time. That I don't know. As far as I know, one was in the north and the other one was in the south of Greece. But on the other hand, Greece is a small place. So it is not impossible. We don't have any evidence of their meeting each other. But it would not be completely out of the question if we were to speculate whether they actually knew of each other, or at least Pyrrho knew of Aristotle. Aristotle wouldn't have known of Pyrrho because he was a young man, a poet, an unknown figure. He only became famous after his return to Greece, after his trip to India.
I see.
Then when he returned back to Greece, he attained considerable fame as a teacher and as a philosopher and as a yogi.
And a yogi.
A yogi, yes. Most of in his biographies, when we read, we are struck how He was able to withstand extreme pain without moving. He had surgeries without moving, without even frowning. That's what the biographies we have about him. He was able to, there was this very interesting incident when there is a storm in the sea and he's on a boat, and his compatriots, the other people who were on the boat, were really stressed. You know, they thought, okay, the boat is going to sink. And he was just standing there, unmoved, without moving. A man of windless calm. That's what Sextus called him. So basically that shows us that his teachings, he was not just a teacher, he had actually embodied those teachings. And in that sense, he was a yogi. It wasn't like he was just teaching ideas. He had experience of what he was. So I think that kind of contemplative side of Pyrrho has been neglected by classical philologists up to now. We have been looking only at his written, whatever survives of his written work. Not written work, because he never wrote anything of his, let's do this again. The only thing that survives of his teachings. He never wrote anything. Everything we know about him is from his disciples, from his students.
So were they in like dialogue forms?
Well, no. What survives is actually a passage known as the Aristocles passage, which was something reported by his student Timon of Phleus, who was preserved in Aristocles' writings and then was reproduced in Eusebius. So we do have several generations of this passage, but this passage is significant, and this is what I discuss in my work. And what I discussed at the conference as well.
Wonderful. What beyond the well-known figures like Pyrrho and the Indo-Greek Gandhara art, what other ways might ancient Greece have contributed to the evolution of early Buddhism, in your view?
That's a very good question, Rebecca. Very good question. And there's many different ways of looking at this. What we do know historically is that, after Alexander left, he left behind what is known as the Indo-Greek kingdoms that lasted for about 200 years or more. So the Greeks were actually in power in those areas. They were the elite, and they were the ones who actually could trade with the Mediterranean Sea. So even when they're no longer in power, political power, they certainly did not disappear. When the Kusanas took over, they probably kept the Greeks in those high positions because they were the ones who could trade, who had, came from influential families, who have been there for a long time. So tracing the development and the influence of Hellenism into Buddhism is a long diachronic process. We shouldn't see it only at the time that the Greeks were in power, in political power, but also after that. So then that brings us to the times of Gandhara art. Now, the prevalent position among many art historians is that Gandhara art was created by wealthy Kusana families who hired Roman artists to produce a lot of this Greco-Buddhist, what is known as Greco-Buddhist art. Now, that doesn't make much sense to me. Because they didn't need necessarily to hire Roman artists. Already within their populations, there were Greeks generations, which we can call them Indo-Greeks, or Hellenized people. Maybe they were not Greeks by blood, maybe they were just Greek by culture. Or, this is another thing that I think is a contested issue. What do we mean by Greeks? It could be Indians which were Hellenized. We know of cases of Indians who had Greek names, maybe even spoke Greek. So they're not Greek by blood in that sense. They're culturally Greek. They're culturally Hellenized. So I think we can see influences definitely in art. I think that has been well attested. In philosophy, maybe in the method of argumentation that we find in the Abhidharma. That's very unusual. We don't have something like it in Indian. We don't have no Indian precedent for this. So
can you elaborate on that?
Abhidharma is very much a very structured, argumentative tradition. The question is, where do they get this? First of all, these categories, the way to categorize things, the way to argue for certain things. It's a method, not the content. The content is not Greek, that's for sure. the content of Abhidharma is purely Buddhist. The method of presentation is possibly influenced by Greeks, by Greek philosophers. So I think, it's a very hybrid landscape here. And it's very hard to know where exactly. It's like us having this conversation. After our conversation, maybe you'll go back to your home, maybe you get enriched by something I said, maybe the same with me by some of the questions you've asked. Maybe we passed on this knowledge to the next person. Then eventually, this knowledge mutates and becomes something new, because you bring your own cultural background, I bring my own. So it's hard to say where it started, and I think that's not so important. I think what is important is to recognize that East and West is a myth, that East and West has always been in communication with each other, and we should put aside geopolitical divisions. Back then, we can think of Eurasia. It's one continent. You could actually walk from China to Greece if you wanted to, if you had the time. So we're talking about one landmass. Later on, with the development of nation states, of countries, of kingdoms, people started identifying separately from one another. But the truth of the matter is, people have always been in contact with each other. The Silk Road, and even before the Silk Road. So I think this is what we need to understand, is it's not about devaluing the value of Buddhism, its uniqueness, nor the other way around. It's about recognizing that people exchange ideas. People share things, not because they have to only, but because they want to. And they have a profound effect on one another, that after a few generations, it's very hard to trace where it all started, and maybe it doesn't really matter. So to go back to your question, the influences can be discerned in art, in philosophy, in argumentation, way of thinking, and probably in certain kinds of technical knowledge that the Greeks had, that they brought, like statue making, paintings, their use of stone sculpture. The Greeks were known for being able to use, they were stonemasons. They could take a stone and produce images, beautiful images out of it. This kind of technical knowledge could possibly have come from them.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Thank you. On Alexander the Great. Well, given Alexander the Great's extensive travels and encounters with various cultures, do you think it's at all plausible that he might have been influenced by Buddhist teachings? And how might that have shaped his approach to leadership and governance?
Mm-hmm. Yes, this is a good question. I mean, would Alexander have known something about Buddhism before arriving, you mean, to India? Or do you mean once he arrived, whether he was influenced?
There's two ways, right? He must have heard of this Indian wisdom that attracted him to go his eastward journey and end up in India. And given that there was trading and there was communication between the East and West, it's not totally implausible to believe that someone might have taken the Buddhist influence into Greece or into Alexandria through the trade route.
Right. Well, nothing is impossible. We don't have any evidence of the Greeks knowing about Buddhism before Alexander. At least we don't have any historical evidence. We don't have any written evidence. However, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, right? So just because we don't have evidence, we cannot exclude the possibility, because the trade routes existed. I mean, we have to understand that those areas that Alexander conquered were actually part of the Persian Empire. And because they were part of the Persian Empire, you had people, missionaries, mercenaries, refugees, migrants from different parts of the Persian Empire spread all over. So, when Alexander arrived, he actually found Greek communities there. They were already there. So answering to your first part of your question, is it possible? It's possible. Do we have any evidence? No. Do we need to find something in Alexander's way of thinking that could be Buddhist? His ecumenical spirit, his universal spirit, that could be because of his training from Aristotle. Not 100%. Aristotle was a bit of an elitist. Did he get influence on the way? Yes. Was he born this way? Maybe. You raised some very interesting questions. Certainly, once he arrived in Bactria and Gandhara, especially in Gandhara, he came in contact with the gymnosophists, the so-called naked masters, the Indian wisdom traditions. So much so, he was so impressed by the Indians that he asked one of them to join him back to Greece. And this is a historical figure known as Kalanos. That's my other article that I published, where Kalanos, this is his Greek name, we don't know his Indian name exactly, he actually agreed. Even though he was a man of age, he was quite old at the time, he decided to join Alexander, and he became the personal teacher of Alexander and of the Greeks, and followed him from Gandhara all the way to Susa, Persia. Now, back then, of course, they didn't have aeroplanes, and, so it takes some time to travel. So I think definitely there was some influence there. And then, Alexander really greatly admired the Indian sages that he encountered. So, of course, he died very young. He died in Persia.
33.
Right. So we don't know how that influence and what he learned from Kalanos and from the Indian sages would have played out if he had lived.
Were there any records of Kalanos after Alexander the Great's departure, of taking up any role in any part of his kingdom as a teacher?
Very good point. Actually, Kalanos was a man of age. Once he had prophesied Alexander's death. So according to the Greek records, he knew that Alexander would die. We have records, Greek records about that. When he arrived at Susa, he fell ill. Kalanos fell really ill. So what he did is he self-immolated himself in front of Alexander and all the Greeks. Now, what is remarkable about this incident is that he didn't move at all. The Greeks were really struck how he went into a meditation posture, immolated himself without moving. So he was a great master. Now the question is, why would he do that? Well, we can find an answer in the Buddhist tradition. If you reach a certain age and you are ill, and you know because of this illness you will lose the clarity of your mind and your awareness, it's better to die with that kind of realization than let your mental faculties decline. Because in Buddhism, your last thought will determine your next rebirth, right? So I started investigating this phenomenon. I said, why did Kalanos self-immolate himself? And where does this come from? And this is in my other article that I send you. And then I discovered that actually, in early Buddhism, there are many incidents of arhats, of realized Buddhist disciples, who killed themselves. But they had a certain level of realization, not ordinary suicide. It was the kind of killing that one does when one realizes that, first of all, one has a certain realization and wants to stay with that realization and doesn't want that to decline. So actually, we have cases of suicide in early Buddhist scriptures. It's all in my article. And then as the more I investigated, I realized that, Kalanos sounds to me more like a Buddhist master than a Hindu master. So there you have it. It is very possible that another line of transmission of Buddhism to the West was through Kalanos and Pyrrho. Because a lot of people speak of Buddhism going east. We know a lot about Buddhism going to the east, to China, to Korea, to Japan. What about Buddhism going west? And that's why when you were in Egypt, I recommended you go, if you had time, to go to Berenike, this port, where recently they discovered 2 Buddha statues made there locally, which means they were not brought from India. If they were brought from India, you can say, okay, someone brought them. If they're locally produced, we can assume that there's a certain market. That means there were some Buddhist communities in Egypt at the time. So I think we need to revise our history. And I think what a very interesting chapter for me, and which forms also part of my current research, is looking at Buddhism in the West.
Very important indeed. Let's shift to Padmasambhava's legacy today.
Okay.
Lawrence Brahm highlights the enduring relevance of Padmasambhava, the lotus-born master. Now, in your view, how can Padmasambhava's teachings and values be addressed, be useful, be applied to address contemporary societal challenges beyond the realms of academia and Buddhism?
Okay, that's a very loaded question. That's a very good question, but it has many aspects to it. I think, of course, Lawrence would be the best to answer this question, Lawrence Brahms. I think what makes Padmasambhava very unique from my point of view is that, of course, he comes from Gandhara. He comes from Dhyana, is from that area that we are discussing. And that area was polyethnic, multicultural. Greeks were just one aspect. You had Persians, you had Central Asians, you had Indians. So it was a melting pot. It was a multicultural cosmopolis. And Guru Rinpoche, or Padmasambhava, is actually born from that kind of environment. This is where he comes from. So, of course, automatically, he has all those different aspects. He's enriched by all those different cultures, all those different elements. And he becomes something bigger than life, a mythical figure that is bigger than life, that has inspired generations of people, certainly the Tibetans. Up until now, they consider him the second Buddha. What makes him, I think, very relevant for our today's times is that you cannot fix Padmasambhava. You cannot pigeonhole him. You cannot say he's that or this. He's everything. At times he's a monk. At times he's a yogi. At times he takes concerts. At times he's celibate. At times he commits acts that we would say they're negative. Other times he commits acts that they're positive. But it's all we project onto Padmasambhava, our own times. So in that sense, there is something contemporaneous about him, something one could say universal. Every time, every age can see something of itself in Padmasambhava. And I think that's his enduring legacy. This is what makes him still relevant. And he will be relevant in the future. Because he doesn't belong to one caste. He's not one thing. He's everything and nothing at the same time. So this is what makes him extraordinary. He can be everyone, and ultimately from a Buddhist point of view, there's no one there.
Coming from Odhyana and near to Gandhara, can you see any Greek influence with regards to his teachings, with regards to his persona?
That's a good question. Well, I mean, the way he's portrayed, at least physically, he's not very Indian. And he's not Tibetan. His, what is his cultural ethnic background? That's a good question. Hard to say. Are there any influences? Not directly. Nothing except perhaps the esoteric knowledge that was prevalent throughout the Mediterranean world. We had many cults, esoteric cults that were prevalent. And I'm sure those cults did come to India and to the Indian subcontinent. So maybe from there.
Like the Dionysian, the Eleusinian cults, were there any aspects of resemblance to the teachings and systems and practices that Guru Rinpoche teach?
Yes, could be very well. That's a very good point, Rebecca. I think you may be onto something. When Alexander arrived in Gandhara, he found that viticulture and viniculture was already practiced. which means they were growing wine. They were, all these Dionysian elements, which of course are associated with intoxication, with wine, we do find in Padmasambhava. Padmasambhava is a controversial figure. He breaks our norms of what we understand Buddhism in a much more, how do you put it, confined way. So yes, would there be a relation between the Dionysian ecstatic cults and Padmasambhava? Could be. But that could apply to Vajrayana in general.
True. In today's fast-paced world, what strategies do you believe Buddhism should adopt to resonate with and engage with younger people effectively?
That's a very good question, Rebecca. Very good question. Do you have any ideas? What are your views? How do you think, especially, let's say, young people here in Hong Kong? Because, of course, it's all cultural also with young people. Let's say we talk about young people in Hong Kong. What do you think? How could Buddhism talk to them with their present concerns and issues?
I think Buddhism offers an alternative way for them to listen to themselves and look inside, which is different from all the external stimulants from the social media and also the mobile phones and all these algorithms that stimulate their minds. And I think at some point when they see chaos in life and don't know where they are going, too much information, then looking inside, not touching the social medias and the phones, the computers, could be an alternative route for them to find themselves. What do you think?
That's I'm processing what you just said. I think what you said is spot on. Yeah, I mean, in the sense that, I think what makes Buddhism really powerful for every generation is that it really addresses the mind. Buddhism is all about the mind. And as long as there are sentient beings, as long as there are human beings, there will be a mind. And Buddhism really tackles directly that, trying to understand how do we come with the perceptions we come, examining our feelings, our thoughts, our emotions, not being slaves to them, but actually be able to recognize that, I'm angry, I don't need to follow that anger. Or I'm feeling depressed, I don't need to follow, it's just a thought, it will come and go. And I think in that sense, it's very powerful. The question I think that you're asking, which is an important one, is how do we convey the Buddhist teachings to a younger generation, to today's younger generation? And I think for that we need to understand the younger generation, first of all. Now, it has been a long time since I was the younger generation, so of course that's always a challenge. But what keeps me really going is that I teach young students. I teach undergraduate courses. And I try to make it relevant for them. How? By, showing them video clips, engaging them through film, through things that they enjoy, trying to help them articulate the questions that they really have. I'm not going to give them the questions. The questions have to come from them. What I can do is facilitate the context by which the questions can be relevant to them. And I think Buddhism is able to do that, and skillfully, to help us ask the right questions.
Georgios, what are the next steps in your research on the intersections of Greek and Buddhist philosophies? Are there any particular areas of questions you're eager to explore further?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's an ongoing project. And I'm constantly educating myself of the latest research. The thing is about this topic is that it's very much interdisciplinary. You have to read art history, you have to read history, politics, philosophy, all different fields. to try to understand. It's like a puzzle for me. And I have all these bits of information. So what I hope eventually is to see the threads and to see how the patterns emerge. I want to continue my research with specifically with Gandhara art. And I'm going to be going to Gandhara early this year, to actually see it for myself. I want to visit the sites, visit the artifacts, and just get a sense of the place. So I think there is some questions that have not been answered as far as the Greek influence on Gandhara art, because I think it would be wrong to say Gandhara art is Greek. No, it's not. There are Persian influences, there are Indian influences, there are Central Asian influences. What concerns me and what is interesting to me as a researcher is the Hellenistic influence in Gandhara art. And how did this came about? Was it a historical accident? Was it some rich Kusana people who, the prevalent theory is like, well, they just wanted that. It doesn't make any sense to me. What I see in the Greek Hellenized influence of Gandhara art is devoted Greek Buddhists. That's what I see. When I see those statues, when I see those reliefs, I'm saying these are not people who just hired to do them. These are a community of people, Hellenized, not necessarily Greek, Hellenized, who really are giving expression to their own faith. That's what I see. Can I prove it? Not yet fully to convince everyone, but I think I have enough evidence to make people ask questions, to start looking at it from that angle.
I'm sure after your journey, you will be able to prove it.
Thank you. You're very generous. I hope so.
Lastly.
Yes.
How has your research on Pyrrho and early Buddhism influenced your own philosophical and spiritual outlook?
Ever since I started studying Buddhism, and for me, the study of Buddhism is an ongoing process. I don't feel like I know enough. I always feel I don't know enough. That the vastness of the Buddhist teachings and scriptures is an ongoing project of learning. The way it has affected me is looking back at my own traditions and seeing that this kind of wisdom that the Buddha conveyed in many different ways, we also had it in other traditions. And I never had the vocabulary, perhaps, or the way to think about it. And Buddhism gave me that way. So even looking at Christianity, I've never appreciated Christianity as much. I was born Christian Orthodox, most of Greeks are Christian Orthodox. I never really understood Christian Orthodox tradition. After studying Buddhism and looking back at it, I have another insight into it. I can see its beauty, I can see its magic, I can see some of the teachings. And I think it's the same with the Greek tradition. Looking at ancient Greek tradition, after studying Buddhism, I can go back and look at the pre-Socratics, look at Plato, and gain a different appreciation. I think Buddhism gives you a different lens. It's not the only lens, but it's a very valuable lens to understand yourself and the world.
Amazing. Professor, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Speaking to us about a topic that's very much at heart to you. And we look forward to hearing from you after you come back from Gandhara, what you have discovered, and share with us your insights.
I'd be happy to do so. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you.